Hey, what is going on, everybody? Welcome into this week's edition of my top starts and sits for week 9 of this NFL season. And as always, guys, you're going to get my top 2 starts and sits at the quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end position. I'm not going to waste your time. Most of you should know the drill by now. So let's just go ahead and dive right into this video, starting at the quarterback position. My top start of the week, I am going to go with the man down there in Dallas, Dak Prescott, against the Eagles this week. The Eagles are tied for the third most allowed points per game to quarterbacks this season, giving up 18.9 points per game. When you look at what Dak Prescott did against this Eagles defense last year, he had tons of success. He threw for a total of 642 yards and 8 touchdowns and had 1 interception in the two meetups that they had in 2022. Now, when we look at what this Eagles defense has allowed over this last 4 games, they have allowed 3 different quarterbacks to throw for at least 215 plus passing yards. And then look what just happened this past weekend with Sam Howell. Sam Howell reached 397 yards. And then as far as touchdowns, there's been 7 passing touchdowns allowed to quarterbacks over the last 4 games. They got a couple interceptions, but like I always say, interceptions don't count much in fantasy unless you're in one of those leagues that are punishing your quarterbacks for throwing those picks. So let's go ahead and move into my next top start. I think this would be a great name if you're looking to stream a quarterback because your quarterback's on a bye, or you just lost Kirk Cousins, or maybe Matthew Stafford's potentially to play is up in the air this week since he did not practice this past week. So if you are looking for a streaming option, I would definitely consider Derek Carr against the Bears. When we look at what the Bears have allowed throughout the season in fantasy, they are giving up 18.8 points per game. That is the 4th most allowed across the league. And then over the last 4 games, the Bears have allowed 2 different quarterbacks to throw for at least 290 yards, and they have also let up 7 passing touchdowns over the last 4 games. They got 4 interceptions, but like I always say, interceptions don't matter much when it comes to fantasy football. It just really matters in real life football. As far as my top sits, if you've been looking at some possible streaming options that are available on your market, these are 2 names I would definitely look to avoid this week. Geno Smith against the Ravens. The Ravens, they have allowed only 11.2 points per game to quarterbacks this season. That's the fewest allowed in the NFL. Now, there was a quarterback over the last 4 games that threw for 284 yards on their defense. That was Jared Goff, but he didn't even get a touchdown in that game. As far as what they've allowed in the last 4 games, they've only given up 3 touchdowns to quarterbacks through the air, and they've picked off the quarterback 4 times. And I'm gonna rehash this point too. This is a potential spoiler alert for later on because I'm gonna be talking about some more Seahawks to sit. But another thing to factor in with Geno is the Seahawks are playing this game in Baltimore, and this game starts at 1 p.m. Eastern time. Historically, West Coast teams do struggle to win these games in the when at the 1 o'clock slot. Sometimes they come out slow to start the games because of the time difference. So that's something to also factor in on why you should maybe consider other options than Geno Smith this week. My other sit, I am going to go with Daniel Jones against the Raiders. Daniel Jones is set to make his return this week, but I don't really like playing players and when they've been out for at least like multiple games in their first game back, unless he's like a premier player, and obviously Daniel Jones isn't a premier quarterback. Now let's take a look at this matchup. The Raiders have only given up 14.6 points per game this season. That is the 8th fewest allowed in the NFL. Over the last 4 games, only 1 quarterback has thrown for over 205 yards against their defense, and they've only allowed 2 passing touchdowns, and they have picked off the quarterback 5 times in the last 4 games. A couple other factors I would like to say in this: Darren Waller is not going to be playing in this game, so Jones won't be having his best option. Also, too, with Jones's injury, it's a neck injury. They say he's cleared for contact and he can play. But with that being a neck injury, I do have my wonders or concerns if they're going to or even if himself mentally is going to do it as not run the ball as much, because that's what makes Daniel Jones a quality streaming quarterback as his rushing floor. I just wonder if he's going to run the ball a lot. Now, obviously, the Raiders fired their coaching staff, but there's this weird thing where when a coach gets fired, the interim coach sometimes leads that team to a victory. Actually, it tends to be most of the time. For example, last year, the Colts fired Frank Reich, hired Jeff Saturday, and they beat the Raiders that following game. So there's a factor in that the Raiders could play a lot better in this game than what they're going to play going forward. So yeah, that is my top starts and sits at quarterback. Let's just go ahead and moving to my top starts and sits at running back. My top starts of the week. I am going to go with Jonathan Taylor and Zach Moss against the Panthers. Those two have been splitting touches, but I do know Taylor's going to probably dominate 70% of the touches out of the backfield at minimum. But I still think based on over the recent weeks with how much carry that Zach Moss has gotten, he's still a quality play in fantasy leagues. Then when you look at this matchup, the Panthers are now tied for the most allowed points per game to running backs this year, giving up 27.3 points per game. Over the last 4 games, they have allowed 3 different running backs to reach at least 95 plus rushing yards, and they have allowed 6 total touchdowns to running backs over the last 4 games, 5 of those being rushing touchdowns and 1 of those being a receiving touchdown. So giving up a lot of yards, giving up a lot of touchdowns, and and Taylor and Moss, the Colts, they're kind of struggling, but those two have been very consistent as far as running the rock as a tandem over the last couple of weeks. Moving into the next set of starts, I'm gonna go with Jerome Ford and Kareem Hunt against the Cardinals. When you look at this matchup, the Cardinals, as far as fantasy, are giving up 22.6 points per game. That's the 3rd most allowed in the NFL. Then you look at the last 4 games, 4 different running backs have at least ran for 80 yards or more against them, and they have given up 4 rushing touchdowns to the running back position. And then we'll have to see. It sounds like Clayton Tune, the rookie quarterback, is going to be the starting quarterback for them. There's a chance that Kyler plays, but assuming Tune's in this lineup, I know we'll have to see Deshaun Watson practice today. But you got to think maybe with the rookie quarterback against this Browns defense that the Browns could create a significant lead, at least a 2-score lead, where they lean into the run, and you see Ford and Hunt get a high volume of carries in this matchup. So I really like to have them in my lineups this week. My top sit of the week, and this might be a temper your expectation play, right? There's not a lot of great running backs that you just go play over Tony Pollard. But yeah, Tony Pollard is my top sit against the Eagles. Now, he doesn't have a great matchup. The Eagles have only given up 9.1 points per game to running backs this year. And then when you look at Tony Pollard's history against the Eagles, the most rushing yards that he's had in a game against Philadelphia has been 60 yards. And throughout his career, he has yet to score a touchdown against the Eagles defense. Now let's look at what the Eagles have done over the last 4 games. The most rushing yards they've allowed in the last 4 games is 59 yards, and they've only given up 1 touchdown over the last 4 games to a running back. So they've been phenomenal this year against against the ground attack from the opposing teams. And then when you look at the history of Pollard's unsuccessful games against Philadelphia, he definitely is a top sit for me in Week 9. My other top sit, I am going to go with Dameon Pierce against the Bucks. His Texans rushing attack has definitely been very inconsistent, more inconsistent than on par this season. And then when you look at this matchup, they just don't draw a great matchup against that great front 7 of Tampa Bay. As far as fantasy, the Bucks are only giving up 12 points per game to running backs this year. That's the 3rd fewest across the league. Over the last 4 games, the most yards they've allowed to one running back is 67 yards. And over the last 4 games, a running back has failed to score a touchdown against their defense. So you're talking about an inconsistent rushing attack. Pierce has been inconsistent himself, and he draws a tough matchup. If you got a better option to play over Pierce, I would definitely consider that this week. Moving into my top starts and sits. So carrying over from the Dak Prescott love, of course I'm going to carry that into his wide receivers. I'm going to go with CeeDee Lamb and Brandon Cooks against the Eagles as my top starts. I would even say for Michael Gallup on the daily fantasy lineups, I think he would be a sneaky cheap play in this game. But let's take a look at the matchup. The Eagles are right now giving up 29.8 points per game to wide receivers this year. That is tied for the most allowed in the NFL. Now, as far as CeeDee Lamb, Last year against the Eagles, he had 188 total yards and 2 touchdowns in those 2 games. But he did decide, I do want to note though, 120 of those yards were receiving yards, and that came in 1 game. So he had success against them last year. Eagles are giving up a lot of yards this year. Taking a look at the last 4 games, the Eagles have allowed 5 different wide receivers to finish over 85 receiving yards, and they have allowed 6 touchdowns of wide receivers over the last 4 games. So Lamb has a lot of success in his history against them. They're giving up yards over the last 4 games. They're giving up touchdowns. So I really love Lamb to have a ceiling performance, and I wouldn't be surprised if Brandon Cooks pushes that 100-yard mark this week. My other top sits, these guys are playing tomorrow night, so if you're going to play them, make sure you get those lineups set ahead of that Thursday night game. But I'm going to go with DeAndre Hopkins and Treylon Burks against the Steelers. Obviously, we seen a breath of life come into these wide receivers for fantasy because of Will Levis. Will Levis will be starting in that game tomorrow night. Then we look at what the Steelers defense has allowed this season. They're giving up 26.2 points per game. That is the third most allowed in the NFL. Then let's take a look at the last 4 games. They've allowed 3 different wide receivers to go over 80 receiving yards, and they've given up just 3 touchdowns over the last 4 games. But yeah, I definitely think based on the yardage that they've been giving up and what the larger sample size of the season, I could see DeAndre Hopkins carrying his success from this past week with Levis into this matchup. And then I like Burks too as a sneaky daily lineup because I'm sure his price hasn't gone up too much. So that's something to keep an eye on when you put those lineups together tomorrow night. Moving into my top sits. So I got Joshua Palmer and Quentin Johnson versus the Jets listed here. Obviously, those guys would be more of your wide receivers on a bye. Maybe you're dealing with injuries and you're looking for a streaming option or a guy off your bench. I would definitely leave him on my bench. As far as Keenan Allen, you're going to play him. I've kind of learned my lesson with some of these players. It's trying to be bold on their takes. And plus, I'm kind of getting tired of people not listening to me say just temper your expectations with those type of players. But yeah, with Keenan Allen, you're going to play him this week, but I would just temper your expectations with Keenan Allen. And then also when you put your daily lineups together for the Sunday matchups, I would consider not putting Keenan Allen into your lineups. Draw a tough matchup against one of the best defenses in the NFL. When we look as far as fantasy, the Jets are only giving up 11.6 points per game to wide receivers this season. That is by far the best in terms of the fantasy numbers. And then when we look at the last 4 games, they've only allowed one wide receiver to finish over 50 receiving yards, and that wide receiver is A.J. Brown, who's on a historic streak right now. And then over the last 4 games, they have not allowed a wide receiver to score a touchdown. So even though A.J. Brown did get over that 50-yard mark, he did not register a touchdown in that game. So not giving up a lot of yards unless you're an ultimate elite wide receiver. And then obviously they've been doing a really good job at keeping wide receivers out of the end zone. So if you're thinking about maybe sliding in a Joshua Palmer or Quentin Johnson in your lineups, I would definitely avoid that. Again, Keenan Allen this week is a temporary expectation play, but that would be a name I would look to avoid in my daily fantasy lineups. My other top sits, this is going to be carrying over from the Geno Smith conversation I talked about. I'm going with DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett against the Ravens. That Ravens defense is somehow still underrated. I don't think enough people are talking about how well they have played this season. But taking a look at as far as fantasy, they're only giving up 16.1 points per game to wide receivers this year. That is the second fewest in the NFL. Only 2 wide receivers have finished over 58 receiving yards over the last 4 games against their defense. And they've only given up 2 wide receiver touchdowns over the last 4 games. And then just like I talked about Geno Smith, this is a 1 p.m. Eastern game. West Coast teams tend to struggle to win those games. They come out of the gate slow. So you could see maybe a slow start to this game, and you're kind of wondering where you're getting your fantasy points out of Lockett and Metcalf. If you play them, I get it. It would be a temporary expectation play in your seasonal leagues. But again, just like Keenan Allen, those would be names I'll be looking to avoid in my daily lineups this week. Moving into the final section, the lovely tight end position. My top start at tight end, I am going to go with Dalton Kincaid, the rookie tight end against the Bengals, who's coming off his breakout game against the Bucs last week. He draws a great matchup against that Bengals defense, who's given up 9.9 points per game to tight ends this year, which is the most allowed, which is kind of wild because that's the most allowed. It's not even double digits. I'm pretty sure in the years I've been doing this, I don't know if I've ever seen the most allowed points per game to a tight end be underneath 10 points. That's how kind of that this is a prime example, right, of the how fantasy tight ends are just so erratic this season. Anyways, getting back on track. Based on this matchup, George Kittle this past Sunday had 149 receiving yards, so I'm looking at that to be able to carry into Kincaid to have a strong game. And they have allowed two touchdowns to the tight end position over the last 4 games. So I'm basing this off of his success last week, Kittle's success against this defense, and they've also given up a pair of touchdowns to tight ends over the last 4 weeks. Moving into my other top start, this could be a sneaky streaming option for you. Maybe if you have like a George Kittle on a bye or a Travis Kelce, or like I said, it came out today that Darren Waller's not going to play. So if you're looking for a streaming tight end, I would definitely consider Luke Musgrave against the Rams. The Rams are giving up 9.2 points per game this season. That is the third most allowed in the NFL. And then over the last 4 games, they have allowed 2 different tight ends to finish over 60 receiving yards against their defense. And then they have also allowed 2 touchdowns to the tight end position. Not a lot of great options out in the market. I'm just trying to take advantage of a matchup. I know I'm definitely doing that in the couple leagues. I got my tight ends on a bye. So yeah, that would be a name to consider out there. My top sits now. This is kind of contradicting myself a little bit here, but Trey McBride against the Browns. He was my tight end ad of the week in my waiver wire video I did last night. But I did say last night too when I did my waiver wire, he doesn't have the greatest matchup. He's just getting a lot of volume of targets right now, so I understand why you'd play him. Personally, in a league, there was not a lot of great tight end options on the market, so I think I'm gonna roll the dice and all McBride. That's a league I have George Kittle in, so I have to find somebody just for 1 week. With that being said, if you can find a better option than McBride, I would definitely consider it. Going against this Browns defense, who's allowed the fewest points per game to tight ends this year, then you got to factor in he could be playing with Clayton Tune, a rookie quarterback. Obviously, if Kyler is able to play this week, that does boost McBride's value. And then when you look at the last 4 games, the best tight end production the Browns have allowed was the Mark Andrews, right? A top 5 tight end. And he had 80 yards and 2 touchdowns. Now, the next highest mark in the last 4 games by a tight end was 32 yards. And then there was one game where George Kittle only had 1 yard against this defense. And then outside of Mark Andrews, no other tight ends have scored a touchdown against the Browns defense in the last 4 games. So still love McBride as a waiver wire pickup, especially if you've been struggling at the tight end position, but he definitely would be a temper your expectation play if he's in your lineup, or maybe you can go consider a different option if you can play with your bench this week. My other top sit, sticking in that game, I'm going to go with David Njoku against the Cardinals. The Cardinals are tied for the 5th fewest allowed points per game this season against tight ends. Kind of like the Browns, right? The most success a tight end that had against this defense was Mark Andrews this past week. He only got to 40 yards, but he had a touchdown, which did save his day. The next highest amount of yards that a tight end got against this defense in the last 4 weeks was 25 yards. And then outside of that 1 touchdown that Mark Andrews got on Sunday, they have not allowed a tight end to score a touchdown over the last 4 weeks. So been very successful at keeping tight ends at bay this season, so it's to be a very touchdown dependent outcome that you'd want out of Njoku if you're going to play him this week. So yeah, that is my top starts and sits for week 9. As always, guys, if there's any players I did not speak about that you want to get my opinion on, always can shoot me a message, slide into a DM, and I do try to do my best to get back to you as soon as I can. Other than that, next time you guys, oh yeah, by the way, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the follow button. We all know the rules by now. If you haven't been subscribing or following me yet and you've been keeping up with my videos, come on, hit that follow or subscribe. I always love to see that that amount go up, even if it's just by 1 person. But yeah, one thing I want to get out really quick before I do forget, next time you will see me is whenever on Tuesday night when I do my waiver wire and streamable defense video. I will go ahead and warn you guys that video may come out a little later than normal on Tuesday nights. I have a big my day job. I got a big work day, and then we're going out for a work dinner afterwards. So I'm not sure as far as what time I will be getting to that video, but it will still be coming out at some point. Just hope you guys remember that it will be coming out later than normal next Tuesday night. Other than that, I'm hopping off here. Hope you guys go win your matchups this week. It's time to start making a stronger playoff push or locking up a playoff spot. Wish you the best. Talk to you guys next week. Peace out.